Uh, Dear friends, I am very happy for the opportunity today to share with you some thoughts on the question of race and prejudice. Prejudice is any preconceived opinion or feelings, often unfavorable, formed without knowledge, without thought, or without reason. Prejudice can be said to be an unreasonable insistence in proving an idea without paying attention to facts. Prejudice is acting with partiality or at times animosity. The common example of prejudice around us is most likely that of someone thinking poorly of a group of people because they belong to a certain race, express unfamiliar ideological beliefs, or have unfamiliar cultural norms. There are many forms of prejudice prevailing in the world: ethnic, racial, social, gender, language, and so on. But the foundation of prejudice is ignorance. A prejudice has often been associated with protecting self interests, whether economical, territorial, political, and religious. Prejudice spreads through blind acceptance of biased notions, thoughtless adherence to harmful social norms. Prejudice gradually influences thoughts, affects public opinion, penetrates social structures, institutionalizes discrimination, and ultimately shapes individual and collective consciousness. History shows that generations of good hearted people can be made to follow social systems based on various kinds of prejudice. People gradually become indifferent to the situation and often do not fully appreciate the painful injustices faced by their fellow citizens. Perpetrators of discrimination then use this situation to further justify their actions. Discrimination against a segment of a population presents a formidable obstacle for the cooperation among all, and the whole population is deprived of valuable contributions that the discriminated segment of society can make to the common good. Therefore, everyone pays for the cost of discrimination. Whatever imaginary excuses may be used to justify such despicable behavior during the days of humanity's collective infancy, let there be no doubt whatsoever that such behavior is utterly unacceptable at this time, when the human race is at the threshold of its collective maturity. In the words of Abdul Baha, the world of humanity cannot be saved from the darkness of nature and cannot attain illumination except through the abandonment of prejudices and the acquisition of the morals of the kingdom. In the Baha'i writings, prejudice is referred to as the darkness of prejudice, a disease, a blight that has contaminated society, one of the most baneful and persistent evils, an obstacle to human happiness, a profound deviation from the standards of true morality. Before we address how, as Baha'is, we approach the task of fighting prejudice, let us consider briefly the harms entertained by prejudice. Abdul Baha says prejudice prevents man from ascending to the realms of holiness, imprisoning him in the claws of self and the cage of egotism. And I remember, friends, that in 1996, the Universal House of Justice addressed the Baha'is of Africa in a letter and said, hatred and animosity based on tribe, like those based on race, blight the human spirit and arrest the development of the society that accommodates them. And in the statement on the promise of peace, with which we are all familiar, the House of Justice says racism perpetrates too outrageous a violation of the dignity of human beings, retards the unfoldment of the boundless potentialities of its victims, corrupts its perpetrators, and blights human progress. The House of Justice elaborates further on this in a message to the Baha'is of the United States, which has recently been issued, and you have seen it. It says, racism deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capabilities and to live a meaningful and flourishing life, while blighting the progress of the rest of humanity. Most, if not all, regions of the world today, alas, are afflicted with various forms of prejudice, social divisions, and discriminations. But today, we are going to talk about racial prejudice. Look around us, friends, in the United States, as seen in the past several weeks, systemic racism with its long history of painful, bitter experience and the struggle for social justice continues. Canada has its own challenges of racial discrimination, as many other countries around the world. Tragically, this continues to be a reality today. So, no wonder then that eradicating prejudice from the surface of the earth and establishing the oneness of humanity once and for all became the focus of the divine message for this age, the age of collective maturity of humanity. Two manifestations of God suffered for this purpose. The Bab and Baha'u'llah accepted imprisonment in order that humankind could become free, and endured pains so that mankind can be comforted. We know it was in the path of oneness of the human race that Baha'u'llah, who has come to bring happiness to humanity, suffered every ordeal and hardships for 40 years, and the Bab was made the target of bullets. Abdul-Baha refers to the knowledge of the oneness of mankind as the gift of God to this enlightened age. Baha'u'llah has made the oneness of mankind the pivotal principle and ultimate goal of his revelation. Addressing humanity, Baha'u'llah says, "Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. All the nations, peoples, and tongues are the branches, leaves, blossoms, and fruits of this great tree of humanity." God created all, protects all, provides for all, and is kind to all. God is the real Father. All are his children. All the creatures are equal in this one family of God, save whosoever is more kind, more compassionate, he is nearer to God. Baha'u'llah further proclaims to all mankind, saying that the tabernacle of unity has been raised. Regard ye not one another as strangers. Of one tree are all ye the fruit, and of one bough the leaves. The world is but one country, and mankind its citizens. Both manifestations of God for this age have spoken on this pivotal principle. The Bab talks about God creating us from the same tree and have caused us to be the leaves and the fruits of the same tree. And the centrality of this principle of oneness of mankind, in the Baha'i revelation is emphasized by Shoghi Effendi in these words. Of the principles enshrined, he refers to the revelations of Baha'u'llah, the most vital of them all is the principle of the oneness and the wholeness of the human race, which may well be regarded as the hallmark of Baha'u'llah's revelation and the pivot of his teachings. We see that the divine vision regarding the oneness of mankind, as stated by Baha'u'llah, is very clear. He has also presented to humanity God's scheme for establishing a global society based on the oneness of all races. So, as the lovers of Baha'u'llah, as the ones who believe in the truth of his scheme and are convinced of the efficacy of every provision he has made for the successful implementation of this scheme, efforts to contribute to the realization of this truth constitute both our spiritual privilege as well as our obligation to him. So what should guide us in this path are enshrined in Baha'u'llah's, Abdul Baha's tablets and in the letters and messages of Shoghi Effendi and the Universal House of Justice. The majority of the guidance on race that I would use today are those addressed either to the institutions of the faith in the United States of America or to the individuals in that same country, where the challenge of racism continues to be one of their major obstacles for social progress. But each country has its own particular situation, yet guidance given in these letters remain a source of inspirations for Baha'is everywhere. So for our contributions to racial oneness to be effective and produce lasting results, our actions must be rooted in these principles and guidances. Our actions in this regard should become an organic element of our personal and community life. We need to internalize distinctive nature of Baha'i methods and approaches to fighting racial discriminations. But what truly makes our approach to the eradication of racism distinguished from others? I would like to share with you today a few points in this connection based on my personal understanding of the Baha'i teachings. In considering this matter, I found myself making a list of 5 points. Each of these points can, of course, be the subject of exploration on its own, but I will briefly try to address all 5 of them today. So first is the necessity for us as individuals, alone and within family environs, to ponder in our hearts what the writings say about the oneness of the human race. This is a command of Baha'u'llah. The aim of this reflection is to understand the truth of this oneness at so profound a spiritual level as to enable us to reflect it in our daily life and interactions. The Universal House of Justice, in connection with race unity, says that for this, the mastery of the teachings, there is no effective substitute. There are, as you know, many passages in the writings that would help us in our reflection on this matter. Here is one of many. Baha'u'llah, in his hidden words, in the Arabic hidden words, addresses humankind as O children of men, and begins by asking a question: Know ye not why we created you all from the same dust? To which himself immediately gives the answer that no one should exalt himself over the other. Here he instructs us to ponder at all times in our hearts as why we were so created. He then gives his guidance in that same hidden words, saying, since we have created you all from one same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land, that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest. Reflection on this writing will assist us to see that racial prejudice, as repulsive as it is as a notion, can also at times be associated with certain habits of mind. Habits such as to dichotomize when there is no dichotomy, to minimize the significance of an issue when such minimization is not justified, to show no consideration for the feelings of others because you, in your own circumstances, do not feel the same pain, or to focus on secondary aspects of our identity at the expense of the true and primary identity of individuals. We know, for instance, as Baha'is, that the primary identity of an individual is his soul, his being, human being, an identity that constitutes each person's fundamental nobility. To focus on the secondary aspect, much worse to denigrate them, is not natural and arises from our fragmented way of thinking, which is deeply influenced by the forces of disintegration. There is one more point I would like to mention regarding our understanding of the oneness of mankind. By doing so, we will understand the oneness of human race as a fundamental spiritual truth when we reflect on this statement from God saying, "Ye are the fruits of one tree." This clearly denotes that God has created only one tree, the tree of humanity, and we are all the fruits of that single tree. We are not the equally tasty, precious fruits of different varieties of trees that should exist in harmony in one garden. We are the fruits of one single tree. There is actually the one single tree of humanity, a fact that science has finally come to prove and accept as a fundamental truth. We are not different race. We are the human race. Everyone will benefit from gaining a deeper understanding of this truth. Knowledge of such truth will inspire individuals to search in the privacy of their chambers to see if there are indeed any traces of prejudice, even unintentional ones, in their hearts, or if any of their thoughts and habits and assumptions, influenced with what's going on in the world, may cause to manifest even unintentional biases towards a certain race, signifying anyone as other and not the fruits of the same tree. Individuals, if necessary, can reflect on questions such as these. Am I adequately aware of the sufferings of those who are subject to racism? Or due to my personal positions and the privileges that I take them for granted, am not even aware of the pains around me? Do I have close friends from amongst the diverse peoples of humanity with whom I maintain genuine and sincere, loving friendship, and from which I benefit from the diversity of God's creation, and with whom I can, as equal, have an intimate, loving relationship to gain a deeper understanding of these realities around me? How do I respond in the face of violence that springs from prejudice? Do I seek to have a compassionate, open-hearted understanding of the facts that the anger and frustration of those who are subject to gross oppression of racism may well be such that they see no other possible way of dealing with the injustice that is perpetrated against them than to respond through demonstrations that at times can go aggressive, notwithstanding that at heart they, like any other noble human being, hold a natural dislike of aggressions. Here I speak not of those whose perpetration of violence towards racial minorities arises from political or other wholly misguided stances, but rather of those who have been subjected to such unrelenting different phases of cruel oppression for centuries. Various people may quite naturally see it useful to reflect on even further questions, such as this: to what extent is the focus of my life on the fundamental identity of human beings, being the fruits of one tree, as opposed to secondary identities, skin color, language, culture, etc.? Do I harbor any subconscious sense of superiority? And if I do, how do I overcome such an attitude? Is it possible that I, even unconsciously, have a patronizing attitude towards the members of a certain race? And if so, how do I free myself from this? May it be that my reactions to a number of things with which I am unfamiliar are, again, unintentionally and probably under the influence of what's happening around me in the society, not considerate enough and give a feeling of otherness to those with whom I interact? I'm talking about things such as hearing a name that I privately consider strange, an accent with which I am not familiar, or ways of dressing, eating, or other social manners that are new to me. But everyone can ask himself or herself, how strong is my resolve to contribute my share to the solution of racial discrimination? What do I do to become an effective protagonist in this process? The aim of our reflections on these matters is to internalize the guidance of the beloved guardian, who says to discriminate against any race on the ground of its being socially backward, politically immature, and numerically in a minority is a flagrant violation of the spirit that animates the faith of Baha'u'llah. The consciousness of any division or cleavage in its ranks is alien to its very purpose, principles, and ideals. We should also appreciate that it is one thing for a Baha'i to be subject to racial discrimination in the larger society, but it's quite another if racial interactions within the Baha'i community are causes of concern. The House of Justice says that for a Baha'i, the injuries arising from one's interactions with a fellow believer can be especially painful. So, the second point I would like to mention then has to do with possible influence of society on us as individual, community, and institution. It is vitally necessary to remain alert so as not to allow the negative forces of society regarding racial discriminations to affect us. To do so will inevitably cause the darkness of an ever prevalent and subtle racial prejudice to enter our midst. Shoghi Effendi, in a letter to the Baha'is of Atlanta, says this: the friends must at all times bear in mind that they are in a way like soldiers under attack. The world is at present in an exceedingly dark condition spiritually. Hatred and prejudice of every sort are literally tearing it to pieces. We, on the other hand, are the custodians of the opposite forces, the forces of love, of unity, of peace and integration. And we must constantly be on our guard, whether as individuals or as an assembly or community, lest through us these destructive negative forces enter into our midst. Love for each other, the deep sense that we are a new organism, the dawn breakers of a new world order, must constantly animate our Baha'i lives, and we must pray to be protected from the contamination of society, which is so diseased with prejudice. How often do we pray for this? The third point I wanted to mention is to do with the collective way, our collective way of life. That is the extent to which we try to observe the teachings of Baha'u'llah regarding associating with all peoples of the world with the spirit of oneness, love, and fellowship. Again, we can ask questions from ourselves. How am I doing my best, to the extent feasible, to associate with people of all races in the light of particularly Abdul Baha's hope that through love and fellowship we may advance to such a degree of mutual recognition and estimate that the oneness of human world may be realized. We know that such sincere loving association can be made in different settings. So we have to think about it. How good are communities and institutions at being alert to subtleties of observing oneness? We have the Master as our example, of course. Shoghi Effendi mentions this to the Baha'is of the United States and encourages them to think and reflect on the way Master observed this. Shoghi Effendi says, "Let them revive and perpetuate the memory of those unforgettable and historic episodes and occasions on which he, Abdul Baha, so strikingly demonstrated his keen sense of justice, his spontaneous sympathy for the downtrodden, his ever-abiding sense of the oneness of human race, his overflowing love for its members, and his displeasure with those who dare to flout his wishes, to deride his methods, to challenge his principles, or to nullify his acts." Accounts of Abdul Baha's travel in the United States, of course, illustrates how he took every opportunity during his entire trip to promote the oneness of human race. I will not go through examples of what he did. You know them and you can study them further. But we can derive inspirations from the fact that during these travels, Abdul Baha, on the one hand, was very alert not to allow the norms of society to affect his own loving way of associating with everyone, including people of color, while on the other hand, he did not criticize the actions of people who did not understand the oneness of human race. He, at the same time, spoke publicly about race unity and stressed its essentiality as the basis of a just society, and praised and encouraged those who, in their actions, upheld and promoted the harmony of races. Through the examples he set, he educated the believers to have the courage, audacity, and integrity to observe the oneness of race under all conditions. So he was not silent on the matter of racism. He spoke and acted, not in accordance with the norms of society, but rather was guided at all times by the divine light within him. We don't have to be silent either, nor do we need to feel obliged to be part of the controversial approaches to this matter that are prevalent in the society. We should be guided by the remedy prescribed by the pen of Baha'u'llah as directed by his institutions. To follow the example of Abdul Baha means to remain determined at all times to reflect racial unity in our private and public lives, and to promote this principle under all circumstances. Here is a letter from Shoghi Effendi, and let's reflect on it. He says, "Freedom from racial prejudice in any of its forms should be consistently demonstrated in every phase of their activity and life. This is addressed to one of the communities in the United States. Whether in the Baha'i community or outside it, in public or in private, formally as well as informally, individually as well as in their official capacity as organized groups, committees, and assemblies. It should deliberately be cultivated. This is freedom from racial prejudice should be deliberately cultivated through the various and everyday opportunities, no matter how insignificant, that present themselves, whether in their homes, their business, offices, their schools and colleges, their social parties and recreation grounds, their Baha'i gatherings, conferences, conventions, summer schools, and assemblies. Here, individuals, communities, institutions are counseled to be alert, to be completely free from racial discriminations in their homes, in their private lives, in their Baha'i community life, in their engagement outside the Baha'i community, in their public or private activities, whether formal or informal, and whether undertaken individually or in organized groups. In other words, at all times. With respect to the Baha'i community in particular, the Guardian says this: it should be the duty of every Baha'i community so to arrange its affairs that in cases where individuals belonging to the diverse minority elements within it are already qualified and fulfill the necessary requirements, Baha'i representative institutions, be they assemblies, conventions, conferences, or committees, may have represented on them as many of these diverse elements, racial or otherwise, as possible. Individually or collectively, how do we deliberately cultivate complete freedom from racial prejudice? What is clear is that under no circumstances can the slightest discriminations of any sort be entertained against anyone in the Baha'i community. Listen to this, what Shoghi Effendi says. If any discrimination is at all to be tolerated, it should be a discrimination not against, but rather in favor of the minority, be it racial or otherwise. The beloved Guardian further stresses the importance of nurturing racial or any other minority by saying that any Baha'i community around the world should feel it to be its first and inescapable obligation to nurture, encourage, and safeguard every minority belonging to any faith, race, class, or nation within it. Failure to do so adequately, that is, failure to do adequately nurturing these minorities within the framework for our social and administrative affairs of the community, in the words of the House of Justice, has its most immediate and negative consequences on the minority. As the majority, the House of Justice says, can lapse into unconscious state, the Guardian warned them against. In reference to racial inequality between the white and the black population in the United States, the following counsel of the House of Justice to the Baha'i community, which is recently July 2020, provides insight into the implications of this demanding task. The House of Justice says, the American Baha'i community, the leaven, the stain to leaven the whole, the Guardian admonished, cannot hope to either escape the trials with which this nation is confronted, nor claim to be wholly immune from the evils that stain its character. A tremendous effort is required by both races if their outlook, their manners, and conduct are to reflect in this darkened age the spirit and teachings of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Let neither think that the solution of so vast a problem is a matter that exclusively concerns the other. Let neither think that such a problem can either easily or immediately be resolved. Each one should endeavor to develop and assist the other towards mutual advancement. Abdul-Baha explained, love and unity will be fostered between you, thereby bringing about the oneness of mankind. Every individual in the Baha'i community, of course, believes in the oneness of humankind and tries to reflect this principle in his or her life. But do we create an atmosphere that is conducive to reassuring peoples of various racial backgrounds in our communities, not only that they can fully and freely offer their diverse views based on their own understanding of the Baha'i writings, but also that such views are welcome and valued? Or do we unconsciously afford little room for diverse viewpoints and ideas? Is a loving, productive discussion, for instance, in the community about the challenges of racism considered harmful to the unity of the community? Or are we ready to learn with love and unity more about it and contribute to its complete eradication as inspired by Baha'i approach and distinguished from what is happening in the society at large? So, friends, this brings me to the fourth point that I wanted to discuss, and it is to do with the general comprehension of how vast an undertaking it is for the blight of racism to be eradicated forever from the society at large. Because knowing the fuller implication of establishing the oneness of humanity will assist us to have more clarity about the most effective ways for our collective contribution as Baha'is to racial unity in the society of which we are part of. Shoghi Effendi, addressing this matter, says, let there be no mistake. The principle of the oneness of mankind, the pivot around which all the teachings of Baha'u'llah revolve, implies an organic change in the structure of present-day society, a change such as the world has not yet experienced. The Universal House of Justice identifies one such changes that should take place in these words. It says, recognition of the oneness of mankind implemented by appropriate legal measures must be universally upheld if this problem is to be overcome. And again it says, racism, cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationship among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. The change required is not merely social and economic, but above all, moral and spiritual. So it is natural for the Baha'is to wish to participate in the work conducted by others in various sectors of society to fight discrimination and racial injustices. But it is imperative that we internalize related guidance on this matter. In terms of involvement in activities outside the Baha'i communities, the House of Justice has this guidance. it says there can be no objection in principle for a Baha'i to participate in activities that advocate social change in ways that are in keeping with the Baha'i teachings. A greater involvement in the life of society, individually and collectively, will be an inevitable outcome as the process of growth gathers momentum in advanced clusters. In Baha'i communities with limited resources, too much involvement in such efforts at an early stage may dissipate their energies and detract from the coherence of activities necessary for growth. Yet, in areas where the faith has sufficiently consolidated itself, it is natural to expect that Baha'is would engage in social actions, initially by finding ways to apply the teachings to the problems afflicting their families, neighbors, and communities in which they live. So here the House of Justice relates the growth of the faith, the growth of the Baha'i community, to its ability to assist humanity to fight all sorts of evils, including the darkness of prejudice and the blight of racism. And this brings me to the fifth and the last point that I want to mention, and that is the need for us to reflect on what is the most efficient way for us to contribute collectively to the eradication of racial discrimination. You have studied this recent message of the House of Justice, July 2020, in which it addresses the subject of community building process and say that the concepts and approaches for social transformation developed in the current series of the plans can be utilized to promote race unity in the context of community building, social action, and involvement in the discourses of society. Then the House of Justice makes this statement in the same message. Within the context of the framework governing your activities, it is necessary to carefully examine the forces unfolding around you to determine where your energies might reinforce the most promising initiatives, what you should avoid, and how you might lend a distinctive contribution. So the House of Justice is wanting us to reflect on this concept of within the framework of our actions and our mission, so to speak, we should contemplate and see where and how can we be most effective in fighting racism. The idea of such reflection, to my understanding, is to decide where our energies will bring forth more lasting results. To the Baha'is of the United States, the House of Justice says this: the piecemeal efforts of those outside of the Baha'i community who are concerned with the many grievous ills facing humanity have had little lasting success. Their well-meaning endeavors have suffered from a lack of appreciation of the spiritual origin of these illnesses and a lack of understanding that the only lasting solution lies in the acceptance of the remedies of the divine physicians. So, one of the reasons why it is best that we at this time give priority to fostering racial oneness through our community building effort is this: lack of adequate appreciation of the spiritual origin of the problem is the main reason for lack of lasting progress. And the Baha'is are therefore administering the remedy given to them through their divine plan, paying attention to the spiritual root of the problem, which seems to be the focus of no one else's approach. But there are other facts to be considered. One such related fact, again, as stated by the House of Justice in 1996, is this. The House of Justice has been trying to get the Friends to understand for some time the necessary precondition to translation of our community's social vision into reality is a massive expansion in the number of committed, deepened believers who are well grounded in the essentials of the cause, and then says, parallel to the process of large-scale enrollment, the institutions of the faith, including those at the grassroots of the community, will gradually come to function with greater efficiency and increasing harmony, thereby enhancing their potential in stimulating the process of social development. The House of Justice then tries to give an example of what they are bringing to our attention by sharing this with us, that they say, as the Friends pursue their efforts to promote growth and community building, social action, and involvement in the discourses of society, they will over time work increasingly with other well-meaning people to eliminate these and other problems that have so bedeviled the world. A profound illustration of these possibilities, the House of Justice refers us to the video Frontiers of Learning, and these explain that how this process has now begun in a stage where it can contribute to social reform, and give the examples of Bihar Sharif cluster in India, where the century-old oppressive caste system is gradually being dismantled at the grassroots with significant contributions from the Baha'i community. Let me share with you another example of the advice of the House of Justice that is given to the Baha'is of the United States in this recent message. The House of Justice says, it is not possible for you to effect the transformation envisaged by Baha'u'llah merely by adopting the perspectives, practices, concepts, criticisms, and language of contemporary society. Instead, the House of Justice says, in other words, instead of these approaches, your approach, the Baha'i approach, will be distinguished by maintaining a humble posture of learning, weighing alternatives in the light of his teachings, consulting to harmonize differing views and shape collective action, and marching forward with unbreakable unity in serried lines. So the House of Justice also emphasizes how the growth of the Baha'i community is vital to capacity building, and as this will thus enable Baha'is to take on other individual and collective social responsibilities, including contributing to racial unity in an effective manner. Again, addressing the Baha'is in the United States, the House of Justice says this: freedom from racial prejudice must be the watchword of Baha'is in social spaces in which they are engaged for the activities of the plan. In such intimate settings, people of diverse racial backgrounds encounter the Word of God, and in their efforts to translate the teachings into practical action, are able to generate bonds of love, affection, and unity, and to learn what it means to establish a true interracial fellowship that is so powerful to overcome the forces of racism that afflict them and their society. Consider the core activities of the plan, friends. How a group of people from diverse backgrounds, gathering in an atmosphere of love and fellowship, using the power of the words of God to reflect on life of the Spirit, can learn to appreciate the essential oneness between them, knowing that each are connected to God and that each is essentially a soul. How attending regular devotional gatherings and dedicated to collective worship where individuals of different backgrounds share prayers and the praise of their Creator can heighten spiritual connection between them and inspire them to more loving fellowship and cooperation. Or how studying the words of God in a dynamic capacity building process can help everyone to realize the qualities and capabilities that each can bring to build communities based on oneness. How families become conscious that the spiritual education of children of diverse background prepares them to see the truth of the oneness of mankind that they already have in their pure hearts. Generations become cognizant of that the spiritual empowerment program of junior youth assists them to be aware of the forces around them in society and enables them to take charge of their own development, dedicating their energies to be spent in the path of a world based on unity in diversity, raising a new race of humankind. This is how the framework of the current global plan offers a unique environment to learn these qualities and skills, preparing us all for an ever-increasing contribution to the eradication of racial discrimination. In a historic letter dated 26th of March 2016 to the chosen recipients of Abdul Baha's Tablets of Divine Plan, that's the Baha'is of the United States and the Baha'is of Canada, the House of Justice recounts the range of illustrious achievements made by them during the past century, aimed at the geographic spread of the cause of Baha'u'llah throughout the world, and helping to establish Baha'i communities in every corner of the planet. It explains that initial sacred task more or less is successfully concluded, and the tasks confronting us are not identical with those of an earlier age, but rather are now most pressing on the home front. Explaining that the movement of your cluster to the furthest frontiers of learning will usher in the time anticipated by Shoghi Effendi at the start of your collective exertions, when the communities you build will directly combat and eventually eradicate the forces of corruption, of moral laxity, and of ingrained prejudice, eating away at the vitals of society. So, friends, we should understand this. This is the most effective way we can contribute to the eradication of racial discriminations in this world. But it is natural to want to see the progress of racial oneness advancing with rapidity, a sense that may cause at times feelings of frustrations and impatience. And we also need to understand this. So, writing to a believer about this impatience, the Universal House of Justice says this: the frustration that you feel over the painfully slow progress of efforts in this regard can be allayed only if you are convinced that adherence to the teachings of our faith, though only gradually taking effect at first, will ultimately bring about the change you wish for. And if from that conviction you will exercise patience as you continue in your own efforts to assist in remedying the situation. But we should realize that in addressing the issue of race unity, the Baha'i community has indeed made enormous strides over the past century, even though our response may not as yet have reached the expectations of Abdul Baha held for us. You remember in 1985, the Baha'i community was offered as a model by the House of Justice for the Study of the World, because it was a community, not because it was a community that has reached perfection, but rather it was offered as a community that is inspired and stimulated by the revelations of Baha'u'llah, with a vision of oneness of mankind and a framework for action coherent in all its aspects, and is dedicated in working with absolute unity while learning how to apply the teachings of God for this age. It was the community's experience that was presented to the world. So to end, friends, this discussion, we should realize that the Baha'i community is truly composed of believers as diverse as the entire human race, all of whom come to believe in the incontrovertible truth of the oneness of the human race and are dedicated to the full establishment of this oneness in the world. We believe that the oneness of humanity is the foundation of the divine civilization that will be established on earth in due time. And we are all committed to do individually and collectively whatever is within our power to contribute, not only to eradicating the blight of racial discrimination from the surface of the earth, but to establishing a world in which humanity as a whole is united in one global family. At every stage of Baha'i community's own development, we do what we can based on our capacities that has been developed. And we move forward coherently under the guidance of Baha'u'llah, reaching us through the Universal House of Justice. As Baha'is, we believe that for racial oneness to be fully established, to be real, and to be everlasting, it should arise from the spiritual transformation of individuals and societies under the influence of the Word of God as revealed by Baha'u'llah. Every one of us in the community is committed to eradicating not only the traces of any prejudice, whether racial, religious, gender-based, or of any other nature, that may still linger as a result of the unconscious influence of society on us, but we are also determined to eschew any paternalistic attitudes that we may unintentionally have towards anyone of any race. We are determined that in our personal and social lives we will engage in loving relationship with peoples of diverse racial backgrounds and cultures and associate with everyone as equals. We appreciate the need for and the value of cooperation with other like-minded people in fighting racial and other forms of discrimination, but we are also convinced that this is best done within the framework of our community building efforts. The more intense our community building activities, the more opportunities for contributing to racial unity. We are mindful that in this path we faced a long and thorny road beset by pitfalls, but we are ready to march on with steadfastness, perseverance, and sacrifice. The House of Justice says Abdul Baha made it clear that those who steadfastly strive to promote the oneness of humanity will endure hardship and injustice. And he taught that to be wronged and oppressed in the path of God is a divine gift, for it is a characteristic of the manifestations of God. We are aware for the need for patience as we pursue our efforts to build up communities that shine forth with the qualities and characteristics envisaged in the faith's teaching. Again, the House of Justice says, patience is as important as persistent in the pursuit of these efforts. This is not a matter in which any amount of institutional action, however appropriate, can alone produce the desired outcome. Success depends primarily and ultimately on the private and public attitude of individual. And change in attitude, unfortunately, is often painfully slow. So, friends, let us have no illusions. Much remains to be done. But also, let us have no question that equipped with divine principles enshrined in the faith's teaching, and the determination to ever improve our efforts to reflect them in our individual and collective lives and activities, the sustaining confirmations of the divine beloved will support us and carry us onwards, and the oneness of human race will be firmly established in the world, making the earth the mirror image of the kingdom of God. People of diverse color, race, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds will indeed live together in harmony and equality like the fruits of one tree and the flowers of one garden. We take great comfort in the Master's unerring assurance that racial prejudice will one day be eliminated from the face of the earth. It was a great opportunity, friends, to spend this time with you and discuss this very important matter.